In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the US Navy's battle line had a distinctly on-again, off-again relationship with torpedoes. After ignoring them, largely on the grounds of not having a battle line, in the 1870s and 1880s, the appearance of the first US pre-dreadnoughts meant a torpedo armament was fitted. And then, when a number of above-water torpedo launchers were seen to explode in the Spanish-American War, these weapons were moved below the waterline or removed entirely. And then a few years later, they were back on the ground that torpedoes had extended their range to match expected battleship gun ranges, then around 3,000 yards. Given that letting water in the bottom tended to be quite effective at sinking ships compared to letting air in the top, a battleship armed primarily with torpedoes was considered in 1903, but almost immediately abandoned as the range of effective gunnery was rapidly and massively increasing. 4 years later, in 1907, the then Lieutenant Commander Schofield proposed a new take, a ship capable of 23 knots, armed with no less than 16 torpedo launchers, her only guns being a dozen 5-inch weapons, with all other displacement put into armour and machinery. This vessel would rush into close range, using its heavy armour to deflect incoming fire, and unleash barrages of torpedoes at the enemy fleet. War games seemed to suggest that a fleet equipped with a couple of these ships swapping in for a pair of battleships would usually win, either by devastating torpedo hits on the enemy, or forcing them to break formation to avoid torpedo spreads where they could then be picked off in detail. But the advent of the battle cruiser, as well as HMS Dreadnought, put an end to the idea, as the new British battleship was far more heavily armed than previous such vessels, and could concentrate enough firepower to put down the proposed torpedo ship, which would have its approach time extended since its speed advantage had dropped to 2 knots. Plus, the US Navy's analysis suggested that the battle cruiser, 2 knots faster than the torpedo ship, would be about as effective at disrupting the head of an enemy fleet, far more useful for roles outside the Grand Fleet battle, and of course, since the torpedo battleship had nothing greater than a secondary gun, a battle cruiser would be at no risk from it unless it got into torpedo range, which it couldn't because it was too slow, and the battle cruiser could then just eliminate it with 12-inch gunfire. Schofield came back in 1911 with a dreadnought-scale version of his design, but whilst torpedoes had climbed in range from 3,000 yards to 6,000 yards, effective gun range was estimated to have increased to 12,000 yards. Even in the best case estimates, this would need a ship to spend about 10 minutes on a direct approach in order to get to launch range, whilst under fire from at least a dozen or more salvos from ships armed with 8 to 10 heavy guns, and that was assuming it was being shot at purely by the ship that it itself was targeting. This was not seen as a survivable concept, and it was batted away once again. Not to be discouraged, Schofield persisted, and the next year the US Navy's design branch was tasked with sketching out some possible torpedo-based battleships. High speed and heavy armour were required to allow the ship to run in as fast as possible whilst taking hits, and at this scale at least some heavy gun armament was called for in order to provide additional utility. If nothing else, near point-blank range gunfire directed at less well-protected conventional battleships might do some good in and of itself. A series of designs were drawn up over the summer of 1912. The first 3 were 30,000-ton ships, one armed with 6 14-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes, the next with 3 14-inch guns and 12 torpedo tubes, and the last with no heavy guns, just 16 single 6-inch guns, which was an armament shared by all the designs, in exchange for no less than 18 torpedo tubes. Maximum belt thickness also increased from 7.5 to 10 inches and then to 13 inches. Speed across all the designs was about 27 knots. But this was not seen as fast enough to survive the closing speed against an enemy that was armed with battle cruisers and steadily faster battleships. Nor was the armour on the first 2 anything close to strong enough. And so another 3 designs were drawn up, a ship of just over 34,000 tons that was capable of 31 knots, with a pair of twin 14-inch turrets and no less than 40 6-inch guns, along with 8 torpedo tubes, but was less a battleship and more a giant protected cruiser, as it had 0 belt armour, relying on a 4-inch turtleback deck instead. Pushing the weight up to 36,000 tons offered either another 4 inches on the armour deck for the same overall capabilities, Or at 35,500 tons and dropping speed to 30 knots and swapping out all of those 6-inch guns for 3-inch versions, you could get another 8 torpedo tubes for a total of 16, plus a narrow 14-inch thick armour belt. The US Navy concluded that the problem was machinery. The power plant needed to reach such speeds took up so much space that this made the ship larger than was needed for any reasonable number of guns and torpedoes, and of course that larger hull meant increased weight, which needed more power, etc., very nearly into an infinitely spiralling loop. They were right at the time, although increasingly powerful machinery would likely have made the concept slightly more viable in the latter part of the 1910s, but the concept would never reach that time period as it was finally dropped at the end of 1912, albeit with a slight carryover in that the next few generations of US battleships would be designed with fairly heavy torpedo armaments, 4, 6, and even 8 tubes being sketched, although in most cases this was quite reduced by the time the ships actually got to the final design and build stage.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.